The snow had been falling since noon, and by 7 o'clock on Christmas Eve it had buried the world under a silence so complete that even the city seemed to be holding its breath. Not out of reverence, out of cold. Arthur Pendleton stood in the hallway of the third floor of 44 Crestfield Avenue, and he was doing the thing he had trained himself never to do in front of his daughter. He was begging. Mr. Thorne. His voice was measured low. He kept his hands at his sides, even though every instinct he possessed told him to ball them into fists. I have most of it. I have $460 in cash, right here, and I'll have the rest by the second week of January. I've already been promised the overtime. I just need 2 more weeks. Marcus Thorne stood in the doorway of the building's management office, one hand resting on the door frame, as though he owned not merely the building, but the very air inside it. Which, in a legal sense, he did. He was a tall man who had gone soft in the middle, the kind of softness that comes not from laziness, but from too many expensive meals taken in places where the portions were described as artisanal. He wore a cashmere sweater the color of burgundy wine and a watch that cost more than Arthur earned in 6 months. He was looking at Arthur the way a man looks at a stain he has been meaning to have cleaned. For 60, Marcus said, drawing the words out slowly, savoring them. You're short by $240. On Christmas Eve, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. Nothing about Marcus Thorne was warm. Do you know how many people have told me that story, Pendleton? The overtime, the second week of January, the I just need a little more time speech? It's a classic. I'll give you that. Daddy. The small voice came from behind Arthur's left leg. He turned instinctively, the way he always turned when he heard that voice, and he saw Lily standing in the hallway wrapped in the green fleece blanket she had dragged from their apartment, their former apartment. A part of his brain was already beginning to accept. Her dark eyes enormous above the edge of the fabric, her cheeks flushed with the fever she had been fighting for 4 days. A thin, wet cough rattled out of her chest, and Arthur felt it physically, as though the sound had hooked into something behind his sternum. Hey, Bug. He crouched down to her level, cupping her face in both his hands, pressing his palms to her cheeks. She was burning up. He could feel the heat radiating through his skin. Can you go sit by our bags for a minute? I'm going to finish talking to Mr. Thorne. Are we going somewhere? She asked. Yeah, he said, and he kept his voice perfectly steady, perfectly calm, the way he always kept his voice when there was no safe answer to give. Yeah, we're going on a little adventure. She considered this with the grave seriousness of a 6-year-old, then turned and shuffled back down the hallway, her blanket trailing behind her like a cape. Arthur stood up and faced Marcus again. She's sick, he said, and this time he did not try to keep the edge out of his voice entirely. She has a chronic respiratory condition. It's Christmas Eve and the temperature outside is dropping below 20 degrees. I am asking you, as one human being to another, to give me 2 weeks. Marcus glanced down the hallway toward Lily with an expression that could only be described as profoundly uninterested. Then he looked back at Arthur. As one human being to another, he repeated, and something in the way he said it made it clear he found the phrase faintly ridiculous. That's touching. It really is. But this is a business, Pendleton, and you are a bad debt. I've already had the locks changed. Your key won't work. He pulled a folded piece of paper from the pocket of his trousers and held it out. That's your formal notice. Your belongings are at the end of the hall. You have 30 minutes before I call the police. Arthur looked at the paper. He did not take it immediately. He stood there for a long moment in the buzzing fluorescent light of the third-floor hallway, and he thought about his daughter's fever and the temperature outside, and he thought about the single father who had worked 7 days a week for 3 years, who had never once missed a payment until a medical bill had carved a hole in his finances that he simply could not fill fast enough. He thought about how it felt to have done everything right and still end up here, in this hallway, looking at a man in a cashmere sweater who was studying his fingernails. He took the paper. He said nothing. He turned and walked back to his daughter. The belongings that Marcus had placed at the end of the hallway, had thrown was more accurate, because 3 of Arthur's books were splayed open on the floor, and the cardboard box containing his kitchen items had split at the bottom, scattering a handful of mismatched utensils across the linoleum, amounted to 2 duffel bags, 1 milk crate of books, and Lily's small pink backpack decorated with cartoon elephants. Arthur packed what he could carry into the 2 duffel bags. He left the books. He slung 1 bag across each shoulder, picked up Lily's backpack, and then crouched down again in front of his daughter. "Okay, Bug." He unzipped her backpack and pulled out her winter coat, the puffy purple one with the broken zipper that he kept meaning to fix, and he helped her into it, his fingers working the broken zipper halfway up before it caught. He pulled her knitted hat down over her ears and tugged her mittens onto her hands. Then he wrapped her blanket around the outside of all of it, creating a makeshift cocoon. "You're going to ride on my back. Like a backpack." "Okay." Lily smiled, even with fever-bright eyes and a runny nose. Even in the drafty hallway of a building they were being legally expelled from on Christmas Eve, she smiled at the prospect of being carried on her father's back. "Okay," she said. He hoisted her up. She wrapped her arms around his neck and her legs around his waist, and Arthur stood up with both duffel bags straining at his shoulders, his daughter's warmth pressed against his back, and he walked toward the stairwell. Behind him, he heard Marcus's office door click shut. The cold when they stepped outside was something beyond cold. It was the kind of temperature that had a physical texture, that pressed against exposed skin like a blade. The street in front of 44, Crestfield Avenue, was half an inch deep in fresh snow, and the wind was picking up from the northwest, driving flakes horizontally across the pools of amber light thrown by the street lamps. Arthur stood on the pavement for 3 seconds, orienting himself, and he felt Lily burrow her face into the back of his neck. "It's really cold, Daddy," she whispered. "I know, Bug." He reached back and pressed his hand against her blanketed leg, checking her warmth. Then he shifted the bags on his shoulders, lowered his chin against the wind, and started walking. "We're going to find somewhere warm. I promise." He had $460 in his pocket, a prepaid cell phone with 11 minutes of credit remaining, and no idea where he was going to sleep that night. He walked anyway. The emergency shelter on Dunmore Street was full. The woman at the intake desk had apologized with the weary sincerity of someone who had apologized the same way 100 times that evening, and she had given Arthur the address of a second shelter 6 blocks north. That shelter, when he finally reached it, Lily dozing fitfully against his back, her breathing wet and ragged in a way that frightened him, had a sign in the window, "Capacity reached." God bless. Arthur stood on the pavement outside the second shelter and let himself feel the full weight of the situation for exactly 5 seconds. He counted them. 5 seconds of despair, of rage, of the specific grief that comes from loving someone with your whole heart and being unable to protect them. He allowed himself those 5 seconds because he had found, over the past 3 years of doing this alone, that the feelings did not go away if you ignored them. They just moved somewhere deeper and more dangerous. Then he started walking again. He was heading south on Aldgate Street, moving through one of the city's older, wealthier neighborhoods. The kind of area where the Christmas lights were white and tasteful rather than multicolored and exuberant, where the townhouses had polished brass door knockers and the cars parked along the curb were the kind that didn't need to announce what they cost. When he saw the man fall, he was across the street, perhaps 40 feet ahead, an elderly man in a dark overcoat, walking alone, which struck Arthur even as he processed the scene as strange. This old man alone in this neighborhood at 7 on Christmas Eve, who simply stopped in the middle of the pavement, went very still for a moment, and then went down. Not a trip, not a stumble, a collapse, the terrible totality of a body surrendering all at once. Arthur ran. He reached the man in seconds, dropping to his knees in the snow. The man was perhaps 75, perhaps older, with thick white hair and a face that in better circumstances probably projected considerable authority. Now it was gray-white, the color of the snow beneath him, and he was clutching the lapel of his own coat with one clawing hand, his mouth working soundlessly, his eyes, pale gray eyes, the color of frozen water, fixed on Arthur's face with an expression that Arthur recognized. "I am terrified, and I do not want to die." "I've got you," Arthur said. "I've got you, sir. Stay with me." He pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck. The pulse was there but wrong, irregular, thready, the kind of heartbeat that came and went like a radio signal losing its tower. Arthur had done a first aid and CPR certification course 2 years ago, required by one of his jobs. He pulled the memory up now and acted on it with a speed that surprised even himself. "Lily." He could feel her weight shift on his back as she woke. "I need you to stay very still and hold on tight, okay? Don't let go. Can you do that?" "Yes," she said, in the small, serious voice she used when she understood that something was genuinely wrong. Arthur unzipped his own coat. He pulled it off. The cold hit him like a wall, and he laid it over the man's torso, tucking it around his shoulders. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket. 11 minutes of credit. He dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? I need an ambulance at. He looked up, found a street sign. The corner of Aldgate and Weston. I have a male, elderly, possible cardiac event. He's conscious but barely. He needs to come right now. Sir, stay on the line. Help is on the way. Can you tell me? I'm going to start compressions if his pulse drops. Just get someone here. The pulse dropped. Arthur began compressions, one hand over the other, counting under his breath, Lily's arms still wrapped around his neck. He was kneeling in 3 inches of snow in a 20-degree night with no coat, performing CPR on a stranger, and somewhere in the rational corner of his mind the absurdity of his situation registered as something almost perfectly surreal. But the rest of his mind was entirely focused on the count. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, 30 compressions, 2 breaths, and on the gray-white face beneath him and the pale gray eyes that were still open, still looking at him with that terrified, please don't let me die expression. You're all right, Arthur said, between sets of compressions, because he had been told once that people in cardiac distress could hear and that the sound of a calm voice helped. You're going to be all right. The ambulance is coming. Stay with me. What's your name? The man's lips moved. Arthur leaned closer. Elias, the man rasped. Elias. Good. I'm Arthur. I've got you, Elias. Stay with me. The ambulance arrived in 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Arthur knew because he counted those too. The paramedics were efficient and kind, and one of them, a broad-shouldered woman named Patterson according to her badge, looked at Arthur kneeling shirtless cold in the snow and said, with some feeling, Sir, are you all right? My daughter, Arthur said. She has a respiratory condition and a fever. She needs to be seen. Patterson looked at Lily, still clinging to Arthur's back, her eyes enormous and watchful. Then she looked at the coat Arthur had placed over Elias. Is that your coat? She asked. He needed it more than I did, Arthur said. Patterson gave him a look that he would not understand the significance of until much later. Then she said, Both of you, in the ambulance. Now. The waiting room of St. Aldgate's Memorial Hospital was beige and fluorescent and smelled of antiseptic and burned coffee and the particular sadness of people waiting for news that might not be good. Arthur sat in a plastic chair in the corner, Lily asleep across his lap with her head on his folded jacket. Elias's coat, which the paramedics had returned to Arthur once they had Elias on the stretcher, was now draped across Lily's sleeping form. It smelled of sandalwood and something older, wood smoke perhaps, and was made of wool so fine it felt like something out of another world. A nurse had seen to Lily. Her fever was high, but manageable. She needed rest, warmth, fluids, and the nebulizer treatment she received within 30 minutes of arrival. Watching his daughter breathe more easily afterward was the single greatest relief Arthur had felt in months, a knot in his chest loosening so suddenly it almost hurt. He sat with her sleeping on his lap, and he watched the emergency department doors, and he waited. He did not know who Elias was. He did not think about it. He had done what he had done because a man was dying in the snow, and there was no calculation to be made, no pros and cons to weigh. You either stopped or you didn't. He had stopped. Elena Vance arrived at 11:53 p.m. He heard her before he saw her, the sound of brisk, purposeful footsteps and a low, controlled voice issuing quiet instructions. And then the waiting room doors opened, and she walked in with the contained energy of someone who had been awake for 20 hours and was not going to allow that fact to inconvenience anybody. She was tall, dressed in a charcoal gray coat that looked expensive in the way that truly expensive things look, understated, precise. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her face was very still. 2 men in dark coats flanked her. Security. Private. She went directly to the reception desk. Arthur watched her speak to the duty nurse, watched the nurse's posture shift in the subtle way that people's postures shift when they realize they are talking to someone with the authority to make things complicated. Within 90 seconds, a doctor had been summoned. Then she turned and looked at the waiting room. Her eyes found Arthur immediately, perhaps because he was the only one sitting upright rather than hunched with anxiety, or perhaps because of the fine wool coat draped across the sleeping child, which she recognized. She walked toward him with the directness of someone who did not take indirect routes. You're the man who found him, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Arthur said. He kept his voice low so as not to wake Lily. She studied him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that she usually reserved for contracts. Thorough, methodical, missing nothing. He was 34, he looked 34, broad-shouldered and tired in that deep structural way that went beyond a single sleepless night. His clothes were decent but worn. He had no coat. He was sitting in the corner of a charity hospital's emergency waiting room on Christmas Eve with a sick child across his lap, and he was sitting straight-backed, hands steady, expression calm, and he did not look like someone who was about to ask her for anything. This was unexpected. "What do you want?" she asked. She said it directly, without inflection, the way she asked it in boardrooms when people had been circling a point for too long. Arthur looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not offense, not quite, but a quiet, internal adjustment, as though he were recalibrating his assessment of the situation. "Nothing," he said. "Everyone wants something." "I'm sure they do," he said. "I'd like Lily to keep sleeping, if that counts. She's had a rough night." Elena looked at the child. Lily was deeply, peacefully asleep, one fist curled beneath her chin, her breathing clear, and even now after the nebulizer. The wool coat rose and fell gently with each breath. Something shifted in Elena's face. The smallest thing. A fraction of a degree. "You gave him your coat," she said. "He was colder than I was. That coat is worth $3,000. Arthur glanced at the coat. "Huh," he said mildly. "You didn't know that." "I didn't. Does knowing it change anything?" He thought about this with what appeared to be genuine consideration. "No," he said. "Not really." Elena was quiet for a moment. She was not accustomed to feeling wrong-footed in conversations. It was an unusual sensation, and she was not entirely sure she liked it. "I need to ask you some questions," she said. "Go ahead." "Not here." She glanced at Lily. Then, and this surprised her almost as much as it surprised Arthur. "Is there somewhere she'd be more comfortable? There's a family room on the second floor that's empty at this hour." Arthur looked at her steadily. "That would be kind," he said. "Thank you." She directed one of her security detail to carry Lily. Arthur, after a brief internal deliberation, allowed this, though he walked close enough to intervene immediately if he needed to, and they moved to the family room on the second floor, which was warmer and softer lit, and had a small sofa on which Lily was gently settled without waking. Elena sat across from Arthur at the small table in the center of the room and asked her questions with the efficiency of someone who cross-examined witnesses for a living. Who was he? What had he seen? Where exactly had he found Elias? Had Elias said anything before losing consciousness? Arthur answered each question directly and without embellishment. Then Elena said, "Where are you staying tonight?" The question was asked in the same professional tone as all the others. Arthur met her gaze. "I haven't figured that out yet," he said. The silence that followed was brief but complete. "The shelters were full," she said. "Yes." "You were evicted." "Yes." "Tonight." "Christmas Eve," he confirmed, and the simple flatness with which he said it. No self-pity, no performance, just the fact, was what finally, definitively, cracked something in Elena Vance that she had not allowed to be cracked in a very long time. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she said, quietly, "My uncle has a guest property on his estate. It's heated and furnished." A pause. "I'll arrange for you to use it while we sort out the details of your situation." Arthur looked at her for a long moment. He had the sense that she was someone for whom this kind of offer did not come naturally, that it had cost her something she did not usually spend. "I'll work for it," he said. "Whatever needs doing around the property. I won't take charity." Elena regarded him with an expression that, had it appeared on the face of anyone else in her professional world, she would have called bewilderment. She had not expected that. "Fine," she said, and stood up. "I'll have the car brought around." The Vance estate sat 12 miles outside the city proper, at the end of a private road flanked by bare-boned oaks that in summer must have formed a cathedral arch. They arrived after midnight, and the main house, a Georgian-era stone building, 3 stories, dark except for 2 amber windows on the ground floor, rose out of the snowfield like something that had been there long enough to have earned its place. The guest cottage was 100 yards from the main house, stone also, compact and square, with a dark green door and a lamp burning above it that Elena had evidently called ahead to have lit. Arthur carried Lily in from the car and laid her in the bed in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. He pulled the covers up to her chin and pressed his lips to her forehead, still warm, but the catastrophic heat of 2 hours ago had leveled off, and he sat on the edge of the bed for a moment listening to her breathe. She's okay, he told himself. She's warm, and she's breathing, and she's okay. He permitted himself 30 seconds of this before he got up. The cottage was furnished with the simple, solid tastefulness of a place that had been decorated to be lived in rather than looked at. A stone fireplace in the living room with wood already laid. A kitchen with a kettle and, Arthur discovered, a stocked refrigerator. Someone had been here ahead of them, which meant Elena had indeed called ahead, and that the efficiency with which this had been managed was either impressive or slightly alarming. Possibly both. Elena had not come inside. She had stood at the green door and said, with precisely measured briskness, that she would send the estate's private physician in the morning to check on Lily, and that there was nothing else she needed from him that night. Arthur had said, "Thank you, Miss Vance. I mean that sincerely." She had nodded once, crisply, turned, and walked back across the snow to the main house. Alone, Arthur made tea he didn't particularly want and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands. He looked at the small cracks in his knuckles where the cold had opened the skin. He looked at the calluses from 6 years of work, maintenance work, delivery work, kitchen work, whatever work was available on whatever schedule could be arranged around a daughter with medical appointments. He looked at his hands for a long time. Then he put his head down on his crossed arms and, for approximately 20 minutes, allowed himself to cry. Not for himself, for the version of things he had imagined for Lily, stability, warmth, consistency, and for how far the current reality remained from that vision. Then he stopped. He washed his face at the kitchen sink. He laid down on the couch so that his daughter could have the bed, and he slept. In the morning, Elias Vance woke up. Arthur heard about it from Elena's assistant, a quiet young man named Tom who appeared at the cottage door at 8 a.m. with fresh bread and juice, and the news that Mr. Vance was awake and asking to see the man who had saved him. Arthur asked if he could arrange the physician visit for Lily first. Tom said yes. The physician came and went within the hour, leaving a prescription and a verdict that contained the first words Arthur had truly exhaled at in days. The fever is breaking. She should be fine with rest. Arthur went to see Elias. The old man was in a hospital bed that had been set up in a ground floor room of the main house. He had refused to remain at the hospital past the first night, a fact which, from the controlled expression on Elena's face, had apparently required some negotiation. He was pale and diminished, but his pale gray eyes were clear and alert, and when Arthur walked into the room he looked at him with a directness that suggested his mind was entirely intact. "Sit down," Elias said. "You look like a man who needs to stop standing for a while." Arthur sat. "You gave me your coat," Elias said. "I did. It's an old coat of mine, actually. I'd lost it years ago. Curious." He studied Arthur. "My niece tells me you refused to ask for anything at the hospital." "There wasn't anything I wanted from you. What do you want from me now?" Arthur looked at the old man steadily. "Nothing," he said. "I hope you get well." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, simply, "I haven't believed that in a long time. A man saying something like that and meaning it." A pause. "But I believe you." Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but Elias held up one hand. "You'll stay," the old man said. "It was not a question. You and your daughter, you'll stay at the guest cottage until she's recovered completely. Elena will try to talk you out of it. Don't let her. I intend to work for my keep," Arthur said. Something shifted in Elias's expression. The faintest smile, just at the corner of his mouth. "I suspected you'd say that," he said. "Fine. Talk to the groundskeeper. His name is Gerald, and his back has been giving him trouble for 3 months, and there are 40 things on the estate that need attention. He'll be glad of the help." The following week, Arthur worked. He repaired a broken section of fence along the east garden. He fixed a door hinge in the main house that had been making Elena's assistant flinch every time it opened. He cleared the oak alley of snow, working in the early mornings while Lily slept, so that the path was clean and safe for Elias's daily, slow walks along it when the old man felt strong enough. Gerald, the groundskeeper, a 50-year-old Scotsman with the build of someone who had spent a lifetime doing physical work and the dry wit of someone who had spent a lifetime watching other people, assessed Arthur on the first day with deep suspicion and by the end of the week had begun, without comment or ceremony, to make 2 cups of tea during their morning breaks instead of 1. Lily improved. Day by day, the fever left her and the color came back to her cheeks and a deep, rattling cough that had so frightened Arthur smoothed out and grew quieter. She discovered the estate's library on the third day, a room so large and so full of books that she stood in the doorway with her mouth open for a full 10 seconds. And she began spending her afternoons there, pulling books from the lower shelves and carrying them to the window seat with the focused determination of someone with a serious agenda. She discovered Elias on the fourth day when he came in for his own reading and found her installed at his regular chair. "That's my chair," Elias said. "I'm using it," Lily said, with perfect equanimity. Elias looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled an armchair close and sat down next to her. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him the cover. It was a nature encyclopedia, for times too heavy for a 6-year-old. "The birds," she explained. "I want to know all the birds." By the end of the week, Elias and Lily spent every afternoon in the library together, and Arthur would sometimes find them there in the early evenings. The old man and the little girl, heads bent over the same book, the old man's deep, dry voice naming things, and the little girl's voice repeating them back with careful exactness, and the sight of it did something to his chest that he couldn't quite name. Elena watched all of this from a careful distance. 3 weeks into their stay at the estate, Elena came to the guest cottage at 7 in the evening. She appeared at the door holding a briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who had a practical reason for being there and intended to make that clear. "I need Arthur's signature on some documentation," she said when Arthur opened the door. "Related to the hospital visit. Insurance forms." "Of course," Arthur said. He stepped back to let her in. The kitchen smelled of butter and vanilla. Elena stood just inside the door and looked at the kitchen, where Lily was standing on a step stool at the counter with flour on her nose and both hands, examining a ball of cookie dough with the concentrated suspicion of a quality inspector. "Daddy says the dough is supposed to be this color," Lily announced, without looking up. "I think that's right," Arthur said, coming to stand next to her. He inspected the dough. "Yep, that's exactly right, bug." He looked over at Elena. "Sorry, we're in the middle of a situation. Would you like to wait in the living room? Or, I know how to make cookies," Lily said suddenly. She looked up at Elena with the directness that small children reserve for observations they consider entirely straightforward. "Do you?" Elena looked at the child. "No," she said, after a moment. "Do you want to learn?" Lily asked. The briefcase, in the end, was set down on the living room table. The forms waited. Elena removed her coat and hung it on the hook by the door and stood at the kitchen counter next to Lily and learned, with a kind of stiff, concentrated attention that might have looked like reluctance, but was actually something closer to a person who had forgotten how to be at ease and was trying very hard to remember how to roll cookie dough and cut it into shapes. Lily was an excellent teacher. Patient, precise, generous with her praise. "Good job," she told Elena, examining a star-shaped cutout. "That one's really good." Arthur watched the two of them from the corner of his eye as he managed the oven. Elena's expression had softened in increments, small and almost imperceptible. The tight line of her jaw had eased. The precise stillness of her posture had given way to something looser and more natural. She laughed, suddenly and briefly, when a cookie cutter slipped and produced a shape that resembled nothing in particular, and the sound of it, unguarded, unplanned, seemed to surprise her as much as it did Arthur. After Lily was put to bed, Arthur made tea, and they sat at the kitchen table with the forms spread between them. He signed where she indicated. The silence was comfortable in a way that neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have made it uncomfortable. "She's extraordinary," Elena said, eventually. She was looking at the place where Lily had been standing. "She is," Arthur said. He wrapped both hands around his mug. "She's the best thing I've ever done." "Her mother left," Arthur said simply, "when Lily was 2. The diagnosis came a few months after she was born, and it was a lot. And she wasn't." He stopped. "She wasn't ready for a lot, I think. And that's fine. People aren't always who you need them to be. Lily doesn't remember her." He looked at his tea. "I made sure she doesn't feel the absence. I don't know if I succeeded." Elena was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow had stopped and the estate was very still. "My fiancé left," she said finally. She said it the way she might have read a line from a contract, neutrally, with the careful flatness of someone who has practiced saying a thing until the feeling is no longer audible. 3 years ago, I found out he'd been with me primarily for the access to Elias's network." A pause. After that, I found it easier to not let people in. Arthur looked at her. That makes sense, he said. She looked at him, as if expecting something more or something different. Protecting yourself, he said. After that kind of thing. It makes complete sense. He picked up his mug. Doesn't mean you should do it forever. The silence afterward was different from the silence before. Warmer, somehow. More complicated. The cookies turned out well, Elena said. Arthur looked at the plate of imperfect, slightly uneven Christmas stars on the counter. Yeah, he said, smiling. They did. In the days that followed, the distance between them changed. It did not disappear. Elena was not a woman who erased distances quickly, and Arthur was not a man who pressed. But she began to linger in the mornings when she came by with documents or updates. She began to ask Gerald how Arthur's work was going, and Gerald, who had absolutely no delicacy about him whatsoever, reported this to Arthur verbatim with the added editorial. She asks like she doesn't care, but she's asked 3 days running. One afternoon they walked the East Garden together while Lily and Elias were in the library. The snow had thinned and the light was the pale gold of a winter sun at low angle, and their breath fogged the air between them. They talked, carefully at first, and then more freely, about the estate and about law and about whether work could be the thing that held a person together or whether it was merely the thing that kept a person from noticing they were coming apart. They disagreed about this, productively, in the way that people disagree when they are actually interested in the other person's answer. Arthur looked at her when she was not looking and noticed the way the gold light caught in her hair and said nothing about it. Elena looked at him when he was not looking and noticed the carefulness with which he moved through the world, careful of other people's space, careful of Lily's feelings, careful of Elias's comfort, and said nothing about it. Lily, who had all of her father's perceptiveness and considerably fewer filters, told Elias in the library that afternoon that she thought Elena and her daddy should be friends. Elias, smoothing a page of the Bird Encyclopedia, said, "I think you might be right." Spring arrived in gradual increments, as though the world were negotiating each degree of warmth. The snowdrops came first, then the crocuses along the estate's southern wall. Then one morning in late February Arthur woke to find that the oak trees at the end of the alley had unfurled the first cautious half-inches of bud. Elias did not improve. His heart had been compromised in the fall, and the weeks of recovery had revealed further damage that the best cardiologists the Vance fortune could provide regarded with careful, measured faces. Elias himself regarded them with equanimity. "I'm 78, he said to Arthur one evening in the library, with Lily dozing on the window seat and a fire going in the grate. "I've had a good run. A very good run. Better than I deserved in the middle years, and considerably better in these last few months than I'd expected." He looked at the fire. "You and that little girl have given me something I hadn't had in a long time." "What's that?" Arthur asked. "The feeling that the people around me are here for reasons other than what I own," Elias said. He passed away on a Sunday morning in early March, quietly, in his own bed, with spring light coming through the windows and the first birdsong of the season drifting in from the garden. Arthur had been in the library with Lily when it happened. Elena had been with Elias. She came to find Arthur afterward. She stood in the doorway of the library with her composure entirely intact and her eyes very bright. And Arthur stood up, and she did something she had not done in 3 years with another person. She let herself be held. Just for a moment. Just a brief, single moment of leaning into someone else's steadiness. Lily, from the window seat, watched this with quiet, serious eyes. Then Elena stepped back, smoothed her coat, and said, "There are things I need to attend to." "I know," Arthur said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. The reading of Elias Vance's will took place 10 days later, in a conference room in the city. Arthur attended at Elena's request, though he could not have said what he was doing there among the 12 other people present. Elias's various cousins and their spouses, 2 of Elena's secondary cousins who had appeared at the estate twice in Arthur's memory, and both times had walked through the rooms with the alert, acquisitive eyes of appraisers. The attorney, a small, precise man named Hargreaves, began reading. He got through the secondary bequests, charitable donations, property assignments, individual stipends, with the measured pace of a man who understood that the tension in the room was building and saw no reason to accelerate it. Then he came to the final clause, which was unusual, and he paused before he read it in a way that communicated, without speaking it, that the room should prepare itself. Controlling shares of Vance Capital Group, 47%, constituting operational majority of the entire Vance business empire, were being left to Arthur James Pendleton. The room erupted. Arthur sat very still. Elena sat very still. The cousins and their spouses did not sit still. There was a great deal of noise. Hargreaves waited for it to subside with the patience of a man who had seen this before, and when the room had quieted enough, he continued. The controlling shares were bequeathed to Arthur with Elena Vance named as co-chair, with equal executive authority and the specific mandate to act as Arthur's counsel and guide through the transition period. And then Hargreaves read the letter. Elias had written it himself, in longhand, 3 months after the night Arthur had found him in the snow. It was not long, and it was not, by any calculation, a legal document. It was a letter from a dying man to the people he was leaving behind, and it said, in part, I have spent 50 years watching people approach my wealth the way circling birds approach a carcass. I have been generous when it served my image and careful when it did not, and I am not proud of everything I have built or how I built it. But in the final chapter, which one rarely recognizes as the final chapter until it is very nearly over, I was given the extraordinary gift of watching a man give his last coat to a stranger. Not because someone was watching, not because he calculated a return, because a man was cold and he was less cold. There is no measurement I have ever applied to business or to character that matters more than this. Arthur Pendleton did not choose me because of what I was worth. He chose to stop. I trust him with what I have because I trust that he will stop, again, for the next person in the snow. That is all I have ever wanted done with it. The room was silent. Arthur looked at his hands. Elena looked at Arthur. Outside, through the conference room windows, the city went about its business in the thin March sunshine, entirely unaware that anything had changed. Marcus Thorne's empire had always been built on scaffolding. The trouble with scaffolding, and Marcus had known this, somewhere beneath the Scotchian optimism layer that insulated his decision-making, is that it works until it doesn't. The first crack had come in November, 6 weeks before Christmas Eve, when the city's housing authority had begun an inquiry into his rental increases. The increases had been aggressive, 30% in 18 months, on properties in neighborhoods where 30% was the difference between families keeping their homes and families making calls to shelters, and they had been documented with the kind of paper trail that assumed no one would ever look closely. Someone looked closely. The second crack came in January, when 2 of his major investors, spooked by the inquiry, quietly began liquidating their positions. The third crack was the IRS. By March, Marcus Thorne's situation was no longer a crack. It was a collapse. He sat in his penthouse office, still his, for another 6 weeks, until the building's bank took possession, and he reviewed the documents his own attorney had laid before him with the expression of a man watching a fire consume something he had believed to be fireproof. 3 properties in foreclosure, 2 more in legal dispute. The flagship building, 44 Crestfield Avenue, the one with the Christmas lights and the 3rd-floor hallway, and the lock he had changed while a man held his sick child, was scheduled for a private bankruptcy auction in 3 weeks. He needed a buyer, a big buyer, someone who would purchase the building at a figure sufficient to satisfy the bank and leave Marcus with enough to begin rebuilding. His attorney had put out feelers. There was interest, apparently, from a newly formed holding company that had been making significant property acquisitions since January. A considerable amount of capital behind it. The name on the paperwork was A.J. Pendleton Holdings. Marcus had not recognized the name. Who is this? He'd asked his attorney. New money, the attorney had said. They're not talking much, but the capital is solid. Vance-backed, from what I can tell. Marcus had straightened slightly at the name Vance. Old money. Serious money. The kind of money that could fix what needed fixing. He had authorized his attorney to invite A.J. Pendleton Holdings to the auction. He had not known what he was inviting. In the 3 weeks between Elias's will reading and a scheduled auction date, Arthur had moved through the process of his new reality with the same methodical calm he applied to everything. Elena had been, as Elias had intended, invaluable. Her legal mind was formidable, her knowledge of the Vance empire thorough, her assessment of what needed to happen and in what order precise and exactly right. They worked together daily, across a conference table in the estate study that had become their operational base. and the dynamic between them had evolved into something that neither of them had entirely named yet, but that both of them were aware of. A mutual reliance that was professional at its foundation and something else, something warmer and more complicated, layered on top. Arthur had asked, during the first week, about 44 Crestfield Avenue. Elena had researched it. She had come back with the full picture. The foreclosure proceedings, the scheduled auction, the bank's timeline. "I want to buy it," Arthur said. Elena had looked at him carefully. "For what purpose?" "To fix it," he said, "properly, and to manage it properly afterward. Affordable housing. There are 12 families still in that building, Elena. They shouldn't have to live under someone like Marcus Thorne." She had looked at him for a long time. Then she had pulled her laptop toward her and said, "All right, let me show you what the numbers look like." And she had started building the case, the way she built all cases, with thoroughness and precision and, in this instance, a particular quiet satisfaction that she did not bother to disguise. The auction was held in a function room at the Meridian Hotel on a Tuesday morning in late March, the kind of spring day that hadn't quite committed yet, with gray sky and the remains of old snow in the shadows of buildings and a thin, watery sun that suggested warmth without delivering it. Marcus arrived early. He was, for the first time in Arthur's acquaintance with him, not entirely comfortable in a room. His suit was right and his hair was right, and the scotch he'd had at breakfast was doing its job. But there was something in the set of his shoulders, a tightness, a brace, that communicated the awareness of a man who understood that a great deal was riding on the next 2 hours. He sat at the buyer's table and reviewed his projections and checked his phone and checked it again and checked the door. At 9:54, 6 minutes before the auction was set to begin, the function room doors opened. The man who walked in was wearing a suit the color of dark charcoal, cut to measure, impeccably correct. He walked with the unhurried, grounded confidence of someone who has learned, at some cost, that hurrying does not make things happen faster. The woman beside him was in a fitted black blazer, her dark hair down for once, a small departure from her usual precision, and she moved with the authority of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and had never once lost track of which side of the table she was on. They were followed by 2 assistants and a quiet, steady-eyed member of their legal team. Marcus looked at them with the appraising instinct of a man who dealt in status. The suit was right. The woman was clearly legal, top tier, he assessed, the kind that came with real money. He did not yet feel the recognition that was coming. He looked at the man's face and saw a face he did not know, a calm, clear-eyed face that meant nothing to him in the context of the Meridian Hotel's function room. He looked down at his papers. The auction began. There were 4 properties on the block. 44 Crestfield was second. The first property moved efficiently and was sold within 15 minutes to a property company that had sent a single representative who bid by phone and left. Then the auctioneer moved to 44 Crestfield Avenue. Marcus sat up. He looked across the table at A.J. Pendleton Holdings. He had been told the figure he needed. The bank's reserve was set at $1.4 million. The bidding opened. There was one other serious bidder, a consortium that Marcus knew slightly, a group that had been picking up distressed properties across the city for the past 18 months. They opened at 1.42. Arthur bid 1.8. The room went still. The consortium's representative looked at her phone, consulted, came back in. 1.85. Arthur turned to Elena. She said one word, quietly. He looked at the auctioneer. 2.3, he said. The room went still again. The consortium representative put her phone down. She did not come back in. The gavel fell. Marcus had the money he needed to satisfy the bank. The math worked. The deal was done. He breathed out. He began gathering his papers. "Mr. Thorne." The voice came from across the table. Marcus looked up. The man in the charcoal suit had come around the table and was standing a few feet away, and Marcus Thorne, looking at him across that small distance in the better light of the function room, felt the recognition arrive. It came slowly at first, the way very cold water rises rather than rushes, the jawline, the eyes, the particular set of the shoulders, and then all at once, like ice giving way. The single father, the 3rd floor of 44 Crestfield Avenue. Christmas Eve. The man with the sick little girl and the $460 and the dignity that Marcus had found, in the moment, faintly irritating. Marcus stared. Arthur waited. The silence between them lasted perhaps 5 seconds, though it felt considerably longer. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it. The color had left his face in the way that color leaves a face when the brain is processing something the body registered first, a full-body comprehension of consequence. He looked at the charcoal suit and at Elena Vance standing a step behind Arthur's right shoulder and at the legal team arranged quietly behind her. And he understood the totality of what had just happened in this room with a completeness that was almost physical. Arthur said nothing. He did not need to. The silence was doing the work. When he spoke, his voice was what it had always been, level, without drama, entirely unimpressed by its own authority. He had not rehearsed this. He had thought about it in the weeks before, and he had concluded that the right approach was simply to be himself, which had always, in the end, been sufficient. "Mr. Thorne," Arthur said, "good morning. Congratulations on a completed transaction." Marcus stared at him. Arthur reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He produced a folded document and placed it on the table between them with the same precise, unhurried care with which he did everything. "As the new owner of 44 Crestfield Avenue," Arthur said, "I'm informing you today that your management contract on the property is terminated effective immediately, as per the terms of the purchase agreement, which your attorney has already received." He paused. "Additionally, as you maintain a personal residence in the building's penthouse unit, which is included in the purchased property, I'm serving you formal notice of eviction, effective 60 days from today's date." Marcus looked at the document. His mouth was moving. Arthur looked at him with absolute, unruffled calm. "The notice references your own lease agreement," Arthur said. "The one you've been in breach of, by the way, for approximately 4 months. Any personal belongings left in the unit after the 60-day window becomes the property of Pendleton Holdings." He looked at the document, then back at Marcus. "I believe you're familiar with this process." Marcus's jaw worked. Several things were visibly occurring behind his eyes simultaneously. Rage, disbelief, the beginning of some calculation about options, and beneath all of it a kind of recognition that the calculation would not help. "You can't," he started. "I can," Arthur said. He did not raise his voice. There was no need. "Every document is in order, Mr. Thorne. Elena can walk you through any legal questions." Elena, a step behind Arthur's right shoulder, met Marcus's gaze with the composed, interested expression of a woman who has been waiting a considerable time for this particular moment. Marcus looked at Arthur. Arthur looked back at him. There was no triumph in Arthur's face, no cruelty, no vindication, just a clear-eyed, steady regard. The look of a man who has already moved on from this moment, who has already decided what happens next, and for whom this scene is simply something that needed to be done. "I hope," Arthur said, and he said it without irony and without meanness, "that this gives you an opportunity to reconsider some of what brought you here." Then he turned. He picked up his copy of the documents from the table. He nodded to his legal team. He touched Elena's elbow briefly, lightly, just the tips of his fingers, but she did not move away, and they walked together toward the function room doors. Behind them, Marcus Thorne stood at the table alone. The gavel was still on the auctioneer's block. Outside the Meridian Hotel, the March sky had cleared while they were inside, and the sun was finally doing what it had been promising to do all morning, warming things. Elena stood beside Arthur on the hotel steps and looked at the street for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "He used your exact words." Arthur looked at her. "When you serve notice," she said, "effective immediately, any personal belongings become property of." He used those exact phrases on Christmas Eve. Arthur had not said this to her. He had not told her the exact words Marcus had used. She had found out on her own, because Elena Vance found things out, and she had worked those words into the eviction notice herself without telling him. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She lifted one shoulder, the smallest elegant shrug. But there was something in her face, a satisfaction, a warmth, that she did not attempt to conceal. Behind them, through the glass doors of the Meridian Hotel, Marcus Thorne was being escorted out of the function room by security. Not roughly. There was no roughness needed. He walked under his own power, his briefcase in his hand, into the spring afternoon, and the door closed behind him. The renovation of 44 Crestfield Avenue took 4 months. Arthur oversaw it personally, working alongside the contractors in the early weeks, because he was constitutionally incapable of standing outside a job that needed to be done. The building's 12 occupied units were improved, not emptied. Temporary housing was arranged for each family during their unit's renovation, and every family was offered a new lease at a rent fixed below the area's market rate. The lease agreements included a rate increase cap of 3% annually and a tenant's advocacy clause that Elena had insisted upon and Arthur had agreed to without debate. The building's lobby, which under Marcus's management had been a flickering fluorescent box, was refinished with warm lighting and a clean floor and, at Lily's specific request, a small bookshelf in the corner stocked with paperback novels and children's books. For people waiting, Lily had explained, sometimes waiting is easier if you have something to read. Arthur kept her suggestion exactly as she had made it, word for word, in the building's management charter. Marcus Thorne vacated his penthouse on the 47th day, 3 days before the deadline. The unit was subsequently converted into 4 affordable studio apartments and a common room with large windows. The authorities' case against Marcus, the rent fraud, the tax evasion, the building code violations that Arthur's renovation team had uncovered within the first week of access, proceeded through the spring without any involvement from Arthur, who had provided his witness testimony in January and considered the matter discharged. The outcome, some months later, would include Marcus's criminal record and a civil judgment that accounted for the majority of his remaining assets. Arthur did not attend any proceedings. He had other things to attend to. The summer the estate garden reached full bloom was, by common consensus, exceptional. Gerald attributed it to an unusually warm spring and the drainage work Arthur had done in February. Arthur attributed it to Gerald's knowledge and patience. Lily attributed it to the fact that she had helped plant the sunflowers along the south wall in April, and sunflowers, she had explained to both her father and Elias, before Elias had passed, in the last good weeks of winter, were very reliable. She was right. The sunflowers were magnificent. Arthur was in the garden on an evening in late June, sitting on the low stone wall along the east path with a cup of tea going cold at his elbow and a stack of correspondence that Elena had marked as non-urgent. Tonight is fine in the neat, precise handwriting that he had come to read the way people learn to read weather. Non-urgent. Tonight is fine meant she was giving him the evening. It was a form of generosity that she expressed through these small acts of release, these deliberate spaces she made in the schedule. He had come to understand this about her, the way her care expressed itself in architecture rather than in statement. The cleared evening. The second cup of tea that appeared on his desk when she had noticed he hadn't finished the first. The moments she engineered for him and Lily without appearing to engineer them. He was thinking about this when she came into the garden. She had changed out of her work clothes, dark trousers, a pale linen shirt, her hair down in the way it had been on the day of the auction that had become, without discussion, her default when they were at the estate. She carried her own tea, and she came and sat on the wall beside him, not quite close enough to be touching, close enough that the warmth between them was a presence. Lily was in the far end of the garden with the binoculars that had been Elias's, cataloging the birds along the south wall. Arthur could see her small, serious figure stopping and starting along the garden path, the binoculars raised and lowered with methodical focus. "She's found a new one," Elena said. "A yellowhammer," Arthur said. "She told me this morning. Apparently it's been in the hedge for a week, and she's been working up to identifying it. She'll be insufferable at dinner. She'll be wonderful at dinner." Elena smiled. It was her real smile, not the professional one. He knew both now, could distinguish them as precisely as Lily distinguished birds. The real smile reached the corners of her eyes. They sat in the warm evening quiet, and they watched Lily move through the garden, and they drank their tea. And for a while neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Then Arthur set his cup down on the wall, and he turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, not surprised, not retreating, just present and steady and entirely herself. "Elena," he said. "I know," she said. He reached up and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, very gently, the way he did everything, with care, with intention, without rushing. She held still. The garden was golden around them, and the hedge was full of birds. He kissed her. It was quiet and unhurried, and it felt, to Arthur Pendleton, like the end of the winter he had been carrying since Christmas Eve, a winter that had been 3 years in the building, not just one night of snow and eviction and a child's fever and a strange man collapsed on the pavement of Aldgate Street. A winter that had been one man doing everything alone for so long that aloneness had become invisible, had become simply the texture of his life. Elena's hand found the lapel of his jacket, and she held it, just lightly. When they separated, neither of them spoke for a moment. Across the garden, Lily had stopped moving. She was watching them with an expression of profound satisfaction that a 6-year-old had absolutely no business wearing. And when she saw Arthur look at her, she raised both thumbs in a precise, emphatic endorsement before turning back to her binoculars. Arthur laughed. It started in his chest and came out completely, without reservation, the laugh of a man who had stopped bracing for the next thing, who had allowed himself, for the first time in a long time, to be simply where he was, in a summer garden, with a woman who had chosen to be beside him and a daughter who was going to be fine. Elena was smiling beside him with her full, real, corner-of-the-eyes smile. "She's known for months," Elena said. "She knew before either of us did," Arthur said. "She takes after you." "She takes after herself," he said. "She always has." He took Elena's hand. She let him. The garden went gold to amber as the sun came low, and Lily moved through the long grass calling out the names of every bird she knew, and the names rang out bright and clear as bells into the June evening. The building on Crestfield Avenue opened its doors to its newly renovated units on a Thursday morning in October, 3 days before the first frost. The families who had stayed were given their keys in the lobby, beneath the warm lighting, beside the little bookshelf. A woman named Mrs. Danforth on the second floor, who had been a tenant for 11 years, who had weathered 3 rent hikes and 2 management changes and the particular indignity of Marcus Thorne's Christmas bonus surcharge, who had written a letter in January to Arthur's office that she had not expected to receive an answer to and had received a detailed, personal reply within 4 days, pressed Arthur's hand at the key ceremony and told him, in the way people say things when they mean them, and only mean them, "You made this a home again." Arthur held her hand in both of his for a moment. "I had a lot of help," he said. He had, by this point, 6 months into his role at Vance Capital Group, begun to form a clearer picture of what he wanted to do with the responsibility Elias had placed in his hands. He was not the natural architect of a financial empire. He knew this about himself, and he did not pretend otherwise. Elena was. Elena was brilliant at it, precise and strategic and entirely in her element in a way that made Arthur understand why Elias had paired them, because he himself brought what she, alone, might not have prioritized. He asked, always, about the people. The tenants, the employees, the communities on the other end of an acquisition. He asked about the people, and Elena built the structures that took those answers seriously, and the combination of them, methodical, complementary, each compensating for the other's gaps, was, their board had begun to discover, somewhat formidable. They were not always agreed. They argued, sometimes, with the productive energy of 2 people who respect each other enough not to pretend consensus they don't feel. These arguments were, Arthur privately thought, among his favorite parts of his days. The sight of Elena across a conference table, holding her position with cool precision, forcing him to sharpen his own thinking into something more than instinct. He always told her when she was right. She always told him when he was right, in the specific, clipped, unsentimental way that was, from Elena Vance, the highest form of praise. On the first anniversary of Christmas Eve, the coldest night of another December, with snow falling again on Aldgate Street, Arthur drove alone to the corner of Aldgate and Weston and stood on the pavement where he had knelt in the snow and performed CPR on a dying man. He stood there for a few minutes. The street was quiet. The snow was soft. The streetlights made amber pools on the white pavement. He thought about Elias's letter. He chose to stop. He thought about the moment on that night when he had seen the man fall, and the calculation had taken approximately no time at all. Not because it wasn't a difficult situation, not because there was no cost, but because some things resolve themselves before the mind gets involved. Some things are already decided. He got back in the car. He drove to the estate, where the lights were on in the kitchen window, and Elena would be making the tea she said she was too busy to make, and then made anyway. And Lily would be at the kitchen table in her pajamas surrounded by her encyclopedias, saving a chair for him. He parked in the drive and sat for a moment listening to the engine cool and the snow settle on the roof. Then he got out and walked toward the light. 1 year later, the kitchen of the estate was warm and smelled of bread and spilled hot chocolate. and Lily Pendleton was 7 years old now and entirely healthy, which remained, for Arthur, the most astonishing fact in the universe. She sat at the kitchen table in her pajamas with a bird encyclopedia open in front of her and her hot chocolate going cold because she kept forgetting to drink it whenever she found something interesting. She found most things interesting. Elena sat across from her with the estate's weekly correspondence, moving through it with the same efficient attention she gave to everything, except that the estate correspondence had a habit of yielding to Lily's questions, which Elena answered with thoughtful precision and which Lily received with the full seriousness they deserved. They had formed, over the past year, a relationship that resembled nothing so much as two people who had found, in each other, the family member each of them had always somehow been missing. The little girl who had never had a mother's steady attention and the woman who had never known what it felt like to come home and be immediately, unconditionally regarded as someone wonderful. Arthur was at the counter making dinner. He was not a spectacular cook. He was, however, a consistent one, in the way he was consistent about everything that mattered, showing up, paying attention, doing what he had said he would do. He made a pasta that Lily liked and a salad that Elena pretended to tolerate and actually did, and he made enough for 4 because Gerald ate with them on Thursday evenings, a custom that had established itself without any formal declaration and therefore had, in Arthur's experience, the particular permanence of things that no one arranges. Gerald arrived at 6, scraped his boots, sat at the table, looked at Lily's encyclopedia, and said, "What's the bird?" She told him. He made a sound indicating this was acceptable. They moved on. The conversation that evening was about birds and about whether the drainage along the east path needed work again before winter and about a legal case Elena was building with a precision that Lily listened to with rapt attention because she had decided, somewhere in the past year, that she wanted to be a lawyer. At some point Arthur looked across the kitchen, at the table and the faces and the warm disorder of an ordinary evening. And he thought about Christmas Eve, about the weight of 2 duffel bags and the sound of a lock clicking shut and the pavement in the snow. He thought about how thoroughly the world had changed,